For years, the gold standard of wealth was the Swiss bank account, storing money in the United States, storing gold in London. I'm going a different direction, and today I'm going to tell you why I'm moving much of my wealth to the global south, and why perhaps you should too. Every year at our event, Nomad Capitalist Live, I talk about where I see things going. And what I said this year was, if you don't have some places in your portfolio that people are laughing at you, you're doing something wrong. Because over the last 13 years that we've run Nomad Capitalist, I've told you about countries that people laughed at. And yet real estate values have surged in those countries. Investments have turned out to be great in many of them. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot is having bank accounts and local structures in some of those countries to diversify and protect your assets. What we've seen this year is the US dollar has gone down against pretty much every other currency. What we also see is that Western countries are making it easier for the government to grab money out of your bank account. Interest rates in Western countries are going down. It's just not a great place, in my opinion, to have money anymore. And I realize some people are going to laugh at that. But I'm going to tell you why. In recent years, and on an increasing basis, my strategy has been to move money to the global south. These are the countries that are outside of the English-speaking powers. They're outside of the European Union. They are the places that I see are up and coming. And the first thing is just a higher level of service. I can message a banker on WhatsApp. I get more responsive service. They're more flexible, stuff that you would never get in a U.S. bank. You can get in these banks. They actually are there to serve you, and they actually often propose alternative ways to solve problems or to help you with investments or deposits or whatever you need. So the service level is one thing. The big thing I see is I feel increasingly comfortable that banks in global south countries are safe. One of the things that I tell our audience at Nomad Capitalist Live is take the first step. I've told you, open a small bank account somewhere, buy a cheap property somewhere, build the muscle of I can put my capital overseas and it's not just going to vanish into thin air the way you might think. You have to build that muscle. And so partially because I've built that muscle and a lot because I look at reports on bank solvency and capital ratios and all the metrics you should judge a bank by, I feel comfortable. So for example, Malaysian banks, remarkably strong banks. I don't think there's been a bank failure in Malaysia maybe in ever. And now you're seeing Malaysian banks expanding to places around the region, including a country I've told you about for many years, Cambodia. You're seeing a number of new banks started by Malaysian bankers, as well as existing Malaysian banks moving into countries like Cambodia. Cambodia is part of ASEAN. It's a 10-country organization of Southeast Asian countries, and they're increasing trade between them. And so you're seeing strong banks in countries like Malaysia, to a lesser extent in Singapore, expanding into other places, Cambodia, Indonesia, etc. And so in Cambodia, people have historically gotten higher interest rates on their deposits. Cambodia has a currency, the rial, which is floats in a very narrow band with the US dollar, pays a higher interest rate. Cambodia is a country that is more aligned with BRICS, and so there's geopolitical diversification there. There's some currency diversification there without a lot of risk. You get higher interest rates, and you've got banks that are increasingly safe. So you put all those things together, I feel comfortable with it. You've got Georgian banks, ex-Soviet country. People would say, why would you want to put your money there? The banks, the two big ones, are traded on the London Stock Exchange, and they've done very well in recent years. They've been great performers. Had you bought them a year, 2 years, 3 years ago, you would have made a lot of money. Not only do you have, European banks like French banks in Armenia, for example, but you actually see a lot of Western banks getting out of the global south and selling to well-capitalized owners. So, for example, Societe Generale was in Serbia, and they sold out to OTP. Now, OTP is a Hungarian banking group, so that is European. It's not entirely global south, but it certainly is more Eastern aligned than, let's say, Spain or the UK or France. And so Hungary is having a big influence across the entire Balkan region, kicking out some of the French banks. And so what you're seeing is, yes, there are some stronger Western banks in many global south countries, but increasingly they are being bought out in many cases by more local or regional operators, but they're keeping the strong capitalization. Bank of Georgia, by the way, in Georgia bought, how you look at it, the first or second largest bank in Armenia, Ameria Bank. And so now they run that. You're seeing UAE banks that during the global financial crisis offered basically unlimited deposit insurance. Hey, whatever happens to the banks, we'll cover it. Now there's pretty strict rules in the UAE on bank safety. Saudi banks, pretty strong, opening up. Others in the GCC, the Gulf, are opening up. You're seeing, to my point on global South operators coming in, Qatari banks are coming into places like Turkey, for example. And so we've helped our clients get Turkish citizenship by investment. You can do that by a real estate investment or by a bank deposit. Most people choose the real estate investment, and that may be the superior option. But for folks who want to then take that citizenship and get a high-quality local bank account, you have banks from countries, not only French banks, but also, strong global South contenders like Qatar have gone in. QNB bought Finance Bank in Turkey. And so now you've got more and more strong places to put your money. You're seeing more global South regional operators going in and taking over for, let's say, the HSBCs as the global banks die. Yes, there are French banks or Spanish banks or British banks in some of these places, but they are increasingly exiting. And so what I'm looking at is, how far can we go into the global South? I'm looking at banks in, Kazakhstan and places in Central Asia, where it is a bit more of the Wild West, and yet there are some opportunities cropping up there. To me, the safety has dramatically increased. By the way, for gold too, one of the most interesting new bullion bank concepts I've seen in the last year or so is in Laos. Of all the places, Laos in Southeast Asia. Now, let's talk about another reason for the global South in banking: better returns. You see, in the West, interest rates are starting to be cut. Obviously, some of that will get passed through no matter where you keep your cash. But you can get higher interest rates on cash generally in foreign currencies. Now, it used to be you could go to a Cambodia or a Mongolia and you could get really high interest on US dollars. That's not as much the case anymore. In fact, what we generally see is US banks and some of the priority banks, like in Singapore, for example, or maybe Dubai, will pay you higher interest rates on your dollars than a Georgia or a Mongolia, which used to pay really, really high rates on dollars. In Serbia, it used to get really high interest rates. They've cut that back on dollars and euros. But on local currencies, you can get higher returns. And so you have to understand what the good currencies are. Armenian dram, for example, has been an excellent performer against the US dollar. I've been telling you about that one for about 5 years. It's increased something like 25% while you're earning 9% interest. And so I understand that you're not going to put all your money in a bank, but if you're keeping some liquidity, why not diversify it across banks in different countries, which gives you geopolitical as well as geographic diversification. It means that nobody can come and just push one button and all your money's gone. But you're also getting into other currencies where, had you done that a year ago out of dollars, had you do that out of pounds in some cases, you would be ahead. Plus, you'd be earning a much higher rate. So Armenian dram has done well. The Georgian lari has done relatively well since the pandemic. It's been largely flat in the last year. Meanwhile, you can earn up to 13% in the Georgian lari. Cambodian rial pays a little bit less, but that's largely stable. And so if you find currencies that you're comfortable with, you can earn much, much higher yields. Another reason I like the global South is geopolitical diversification. For me, holding other currencies is a plan B against what is happening in the West. Trump talked about a foreigner, what they called a revenge tax on foreigners holding certain assets in the United States. When I gave up U.S. citizenship almost 8 years ago, sure, I didn't like a lot of things that the Democrats were doing. This is Nomad Capitalist, right? I like capitalists in charge. But then Trump got in, and I didn't think it was really much better from my perspective because I'm an expat, and it sounds like he's going to make life more difficult for me. So I expatriated. And now, as a foreigner to the U.S., now there's talk of, hey, why are we letting these foreigners and put their money in our banks and buy our stocks and get away with... Wait, I thought the U.S. invited capital from all over the world. And so if I get out of the U.S. financial system, and if I get out of the U.S. dollar, I'm getting away from all the baggage and the toxicity that come from that. I don't even have to diversify into currencies with currency risk because I can buy the Emirati dirham, I can buy Saudi rials, I can buy Hong Kong dollars or Cambodian rials, And they either have a peg to the US dollar, or they trade in a very, very narrow band against the US dollar. And so essentially I'm holding dollars without the geopolitical risk. I said at one point, I think if you want geopolitical diversification from the West, have a company in Hong Kong and perhaps make that where your offshore company is based. I don't know too many of our clients want to live in Hong Kong, but it's not the worst place to have a company. It's not the worst place to bank if you can get in. It is more difficult these days. And people say, well, Hong Kong's part of China. That's the diversification part. They also said, well, the Hong Kong dollar is basically pegged to the US dollar. What's the benefit? The benefit is the Hong Kong dollar isn't being cleared the same way the US dollar is. It plays by its own rules. And listen, one day the peg may go. I know Bill Ackman's saying that the peg may go. I want to get away from the Western toxicity, especially at a time when politicians in the West are talking about wealth taxes on their own citizens. They're talking about foreigner revenge tax. We're seeing the US dollar's role as the world reserve currency decline by almost 20 points in this century. And I'm saying to myself, why do I want to own that when I've had a home in Tbilisi for many years? I'm not putting all my money in the Georgian lari, but I'm certainly comfortable enough with the Georgian lari, and I can hedge against that in some ways, where I'll take 13% on my money in another currency in a country that's increasingly friendly with a number of places in the world. To me, that's a geopolitical hedge while getting paid for the privilege. I'm basically getting a 9-point increase on cash that I'm holding for a deal or whatever else I need it for, in exchange for getting away from the US dollar and from all the I think the chaos that could come from holding them. And so I understand that people are going to laugh. I understand people are going to judge. I understand that many people in the West say, oh, Hong Kong has been ruined. I was talking to a guy at Nomad Capitalist Live recently. He said, I have no problem being in Hong Kong because I don't bother the Chinese government. The reality is, my position that I've been developing since the mid-1990s, reading the news with my dad, has been the West is heading in the wrong direction. Who knows, by the way, with the crackdown on freedom of speech in Western countries, including the U.S., what's going to happen to any of us who say the truth about where money is moving the world. I'm not saying the U.S. is going to come after my money because I don't like the direction their country is going, but I haven't really said anything so bad about China. I think China is winning in a lot of areas. It's not a perfect country, but it's certainly not as bad as people in the West say. And I want the geopolitical hedge. Your government doesn't care about you. They're not looking out for you. They don't care about you or your money. So you ought to go where you're treated best because you're the only one who's going to protect your money. And for me, the way to do that in 2025 is to be geographically diversified. Simply moving your money around different banks in your home country isn't going to work. I know a lot of Americans right now in Hollywood, they're moving to Ireland, they're moving to the UK, to get away from Trump. That's not a lot of diversification. And by the way, you can't go to the UK and open a bank account unless you live there. You can't go to Ireland and open a bank account unless you live there. Good luck. But the bottom line is the countries that I'm talking about in the global South, they want your capital. Shocking concept. The West no longer cares about bringing in capital. They're actively pushing it away. Many countries in the global South, not all, they want capital and they're more open. And so here's the hack that you can use as a nomad capitalist. Putting money in those countries' banks often brings immigration benefits. You can move money and get a residence permit or even a citizenship and even potential tax benefits simply by parking some of your liquidity there. So in Asia, for example, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia all have some kind of residence permit where if you put money in their banks, in their currency generally, you get a residence permit. Often in perpetuity, essentially, as long as you keep the money there. Many of those countries are tax-friendly if you live there, but you can do the same thing in the Middle East. The UAE, Oman, you put money in the bank or in some cases bonds, you get a residence permit. You can live there. Tax-friendly countries. In Europe, Greece or Latvia, you get a residence permit just by putting money in the bank. And by having a passport in those countries, now you're opening up your options, not only of the passport you hold and where you can travel and where you can live, but your geopolitical options are increasing. The African Union is increasingly talking about Pan-African investment opportunities in banking. And so, for me, yes, there are some places in the global South I wouldn't be putting my money. There are countries, Central Asia, there are some strong banks. There are some that I'm not as comfortable with. Certainly there are banks, in the Caribbean that are maybe not going to fail, but they're very inefficient. Certain African countries I think are very inefficient. But if you find the right ones in the countries that we've talked about, I think you could even have greater safety. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have the Swiss bank account. I'm not saying to close your U.S. bank account. Those are fine tools to have. What I am saying is if you live in a high-tax Western country, you should probably look at going somewhere else. And in many cases, you'll have to close your local bank accounts. And so where are you going to go? Well, the places that are the traditional wealth havens, they're a pain. They ask a lot of questions. They make you fill out, I've got a stack of forms for a Swiss bank account in my office. It's this thick to open a bank account. And they've been very good to me. But for people who want an easier experience getting into global banking, the global South is going to be a much easier place. And you're not going to get a residence permit or a passport just by parking money in Switzerland. You can get it in other countries where they want your money. And once you get in, you can start to get some of the perks. I mean, if you have Turkish citizenship and you have a home through the CBI program, you can go and get a miles credit card. As silly as that seems, it's one thing that a lot of clients have told me over the years, that they're afraid to close their bank accounts in their high-tax countries because they're not going to get their miles credit card anymore. And yet, the global South is increasing. Turkey is, Georgia is, in particular, those are two, where they're offering much more sophisticated banking products these days, including things like miles cards and some of the benefits that you get at home with your lounge cards. Now, on top of banking, I'm buying more stocks. I'm buying more real estate in these countries. I've sold off a whole lot of U.S. stocks. I've slightly pared my European stock holdings. I'm putting it all towards stuff that favors what I believe is where wealth is going to be moving, and that's outside of the Western world. But the big thing to know about why I am doing this is I think the United States is going to use its power, waning as it is, to make life difficult for more people. And the US dollar will be weaponized, and people who are outside of the United States, who knows what they'll come up with next, what revenge tax they'll come up with next. I don't want to hold that currency. I think that countries are getting tired of it. I think that the world has been frustrated with U.S. leadership for decades now. But what we're seeing is, for the first time, they're getting unified. They're coming together. They're pushing back. And when certain countries get threatened with sanctions for buying Russian oil or whatever else, they're increasingly shrugging. Talk of tariffs, increasingly shrugging. That's the system I want to opt out of. And I think it's something that you can look at slowly opting out of as well. It's something we talk to our clients about. If you go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply, we help people make bespoke plans for everything from banking to where you want to buy real estate, to where you want to diversify your assets, including in things like trust structures and offshore companies, where you want to move your business. I'm increasingly focused on the global South because I think the West is going to make it very difficult to have wealth.